Hello, everyone. Thank you for coming. We would like to commence this keynote presentation with a land acknowledgement. We acknowledge the history of the land Lewis and Clark College occupies. Prior to the colonizers arriving in this area, the indigenous land of what would later be called Multnomah County was home to many tribal people. We honor the indigenous people on whose traditional and ancestral homelands we stand: the Multnomah, Cathlamet, Clackamas, Tumwater, and Watlala bands of the Chinook, the Tualatin Kalapuya, and many other indigenous nations of the Columbia River. It is important to acknowledge the ancestors of this place and recognize that we are here because of them. We honor their legacy, their lives, and their descendants. Welcome, everyone, to the first keynote event of the 39th Annual Gender Studies Symposium. My name is Race Samuelson, and I am one of 3 co-chairs for this year's symposium. We are so excited that the symposium is finally upon us, and we are able to share with everyone the amazing panels, workshops, roundtables, films, and conversations that we've been preparing over the last 11 months. Before I hand it over to my other co-chairs, India Roper-Moyes and Sharon Sofer, I would like to remind y'all of some quick housekeeping notes. Please silence your cell phones and electronic devices, but please feel free to post updates on social media during the presentation using the hashtag #LCGenderSymp. You can find our full social media information in the program or at the information table. We are recording tonight's presentation and will post the video to the symposium website in the coming weeks. Other recordings of the keynote are not authorized. If you are participating in our symposium prizes card, find one of us 3 co-chairs after tonight's presentation to obtain a stamp and an opportunity to win an awesome prize, such as a 1-year subscription to Bitch Magazine or a signed copy of our keynotes books. There will be time for questions and discussion after the presentation. Please raise your hand and wait for someone with a microphone to come to you. Even if you think your voice is loud enough for the room, please use the microphone for accessibility reasons and for our recording. We will have a variety of Professor Jack Halberstam's books available for purchase outside the council chamber, and he will be available to sign copies after the presentation. You can also purchase symposium-related books in the bookstore for the duration of the symposium. We are so excited to see you all here and for your engagement with the symposium over the next few days. If you haven't already picked up a program, you can grab one on your way out. I'm now pleased to hand it over to my co-chairs, India Roper-Moyes and Sharon Sofer, to introduce Professor Jack Halberstam.
Tonight, we are honored to introduce our first keynote speaker, Jack Halberstam, Professor of Gender Studies and English at Columbia University. Halberstam is the author of 6 books, most notably The Queer Art of Failure, Female Masculinity, Trans, a quick and quirky account of gender variability. His work incorporates analysis of popular culture, literature, art movements, and architecture. In 2018, Places Journal awarded Halberstam with its Arcus/Places Prize for innovative public scholarship on the relationship between gender, sexuality, and built environment. In The Queer Art of Failure, he turns to low theory to undermine heteronormative structures of success and vouches for the creative potential of failure. When considering the implications of possibility for our theme, Halberstam's writing on failure felt pertinent in ways of offering imaginable alternatives to success. He is currently working on several projects, including a book entitled Wild Thing, Queer Theory After Nature, on queer anarchy, performance, and protest culture, and the intersections between animality, the human, and the environment.
I first became familiar with Halberstam's work while on a study abroad program in Amsterdam in 2018. In my queer studies course, I read Female Masculinity and was immediately drawn to his style of writing and way of expressing his thoughts in such a captivating way. I had the opportunity to attend one of his talks at the University of Amsterdam and was compelled by his enthusiastic, passionate, and funny speaking presence. He spoke about citational repetition of academia and the cycle of the same theorists being cited over and over again for years. He offered new ways of theorizing and was pushing for academics to move outside the space of inaccessibility in order to continue developing new work and ideas. He asserted that this slow nature of academia prohibits actual change from occurring at a constructive pace. This talk was so memorable for me, and in sharing this experience with my co-chairs, we were motivated to invite him to campus as a keynote presentation. In our gender studies capstone course, Feminist Theory, we read Trans, A Quick and Quirky Account of Gender Variability. This text is a wonderful example of the way Halberstam's work extends beyond inaccessible academia. In his references to photography, poetry, and popular figures such as David Bowie and Prince, to contemporary queer artists such as Harry Dodge and Sarah Davidman, Halberstam gives us a relevant, timely, and necessary discussion that delves into the possibilities of a non-gendered, gender-optional, or genderqueer future. We are so excited to have him here today, so please join me in welcoming Professor Jack Halberstam to the podium. Thank you.
Wow, that was a lovely introduction. Thank you so much. Elbow bump to everybody. I'm amazed we're here. We're either incredibly, I guess, stupid, or we're just really enthusiastic about being here, right? So thank you all for being here, and for the people who felt that they couldn't come, I'm glad that we're streaming. Let me just, first of all, add my thanks. Kimberly has been absolutely amazing in terms of negotiating my time here and inviting me and encouraging me to come. So I really appreciate her work. Magdalena, Ruth, thank you for help with the technical details. And of course, thank you to the students, to India, Sharon, and Race. I've already been really excited to hear you speak. And in fact, something that India said at dinner really gets to the heart of the lecture that I'm going to give tonight. And India said, you know, when we're thinking about the future, the tendency is to sort of look ahead and try to make predictions about what comes next, because the title of this event is about tensions of possibility. So it feels like we're sort of reaching forward. But India said something interesting. India said, we sometimes, in order to figure out how to think about the future, we have to turn to the past. And nothing could be closer to a description of my talk than this idea that instead of this sort of push towards a kind of imaginary of what comes next, where we're all playing the polling game, you know, it's very helpful, in fact, to look back and think about the futures that other people imagined not so very long ago, and then consider how they did or they did not come to pass. So that's going to be the basic framework. And the other thing is, I really like this title, Tensions of Possibility, but as with all titles that are organized around two terms, one term carries really the weight of the organization, and possibility is doing that here. I think I'm going to talk tonight much more about tension, and you're going to hear that in relationship to some of the discussions that I have about architecture. And one of the principal artists that I discuss, Gordon Matta-Clark, is interested in this practice that he calls anarchitecture, where he tries to bring buildings not simply down, but to a point of tension, where they are on the point of collapse. So that's going to be our tension tonight, and I want you to think about that as also a kind of temporal tension about in terms of the relationship that we're trying to imagine between past and future. And maybe some of that material can guide some of the discussions over the next few days. Just to put in perspective what you have on the screen at the moment, the image is by an African-American photographer whose work I'll discuss a little bit tonight, but whose work I'm researching currently. He was primarily active in the 1970s and 1980s. His name was Alvin Baltrop. He was a black gay man, very active in cruising in the piers, and he took gorgeous photographs like this one of male bodies, male, mostly queer bodies, male, homeless, and often dispossessed bodies who were precariously positioned in society, and he often photographed them alongside what he called collapsed architectures. And this is one such image. And while again, it's tempting to think of the man in the photograph who is doubly, if not triply framed, both by the frame of the photograph and by the frame of the portal through which he peers, we probably would imagine him as looking through a portal onto some future world. But I think he's much more likely looking back in that sense that, say, Heather Love has talked about, looking back in order to pull forward pieces of the past that we don't want to simply leave as wreckage, as futures that we've discarded, but that we want to sit with and think with in terms of alternative possibilities for the present. And I think this image really kind of captures that. I mean, it is also, you know, there's a huge phallus over him as well. That's part of the photograph, right? That the phallus is carved out of the black paint around the wall. But even as at that time, this would have been a kind of gaping wound in a wall. Now, thinking in terms of the kind of digital architectures that we're all engaged with, it's also a portal. Okay, so we're going to go through that portal back into the piers and start looking around with the eyes of people in the 1970s and see whether the world looks very different then and how they imagined where we are now. So this is just to give you a few images to get us going. This is Gordon Matta Clark, and as I said, he's somebody who calls himself an architect. I'll get into the work that he does later, but you know, we're so used to just thinking about architects as people who imagine, create, and build, but we live in a moment of intense real estate speculation. A moment where most people your age can no longer really necessarily imagine outside of inheritance owning property. And given that, and given that the American dream as such is so tied to the concept of property, and given that some of the worst histories of American racial histories are tied to property and possession in terms of slavery, maybe it's a good moment to think about collapsing architectures, pulling away from possession and ownership, and thinking in the ruins of a real estate world that is bringing all of us to our knees. And that's how I like to think about this image, is of an artist imagining at the very moment when the real estate market begins to amp up, which was in the 1970s, already imagining how to bring it to its knees. On that note, then, you know, just think about the way in which capitalism is so propulsive in its exhortations to us, that we're all supposed to be constantly doing it, building it, making it. And in the Queer Art of Failure and in other work that I've done, I think that I have been trying to argue that we just stop doing it. And this new work is absolutely about unmaking what is, in anyone's terms, a deeply unsuccessful world filled with exploitation and oriented increasingly only towards a very, very small percentage of the population. So what would it mean, if I go back to my title then on dereliction and dispossession and destitution, what would it mean for us as queer and trans people to think about not making a world, it gets better, these kinds of developmental models. But in fact, what if we work together to unmake this world? Okay, that's what I'm going to be proposing, literally. I don't think anyone in this room today, in this historical moment, can say this is a great world. Well, Trump will tell you that for sure. That he's made America great again. But and I'm not saying this just to be a downer. I'm saying that some of these relentless ideologies of optimism are actually to blame for some of the predicaments that we're in. So under those circumstances, we need an ideology available to us in which we start thinking about how to unmake and undo the logic and the ideological systems of this world in order to move towards something different. And here I think, and in relationship to the temporal frame that you've given your conference, we're all of us echoing Jose Munoz, who did precisely what I'm arguing for tonight. He looked back in order to get a glimpse of the future. So Cruising Utopia was all about being oriented towards a kind of horizon that will never come. And most of his archive is looking back, as mine is, to the 1970s. Now, why the 1970s? Well, for one thing, the 1970s is a pre-digital era. And one of the things that has us trapped in this particular present tense is the way in which we're all stuck with these invisible digital architectures that keep us, enthralled to certain forms of attention and keep us away from certain forms of political activism. So what if we looked back to the 1970s, a time that many people will say was, disastrous, and this is the kind of language that you get. This is New York City in the 1970s, if you can believe it. And this is just one of many, many images I can find online showing you how completely dilapidated New York City was. And it was under those circumstances that this new era of building, and investing in real estate began, was to remedy the brokenness of that world. So I'm almost arguing that we should go back to that broken world and dig around in its wreckage and see what's available to us there. And I'm sure that just sounds like impossibly either pessimistic or negative or not very useful right now. So let me play out for you a couple of scenarios of destitution and what that would look like, all right? And then you can argue with me later on. You can argue with me anyway, but. So there's a little anarchist group in France called the Invisible Committee, and some people will know them. They're often associated with Agamben, not necessarily in a good way, but they tend to stay anonymous and publish every few years a pamphlet that then makes its rounds online. And in the last one, they argued that it is only from the destituent standpoint that one can grasp all that is incredibly constructive in the breakage. And in the breakage, you can also hear an echo of Fred Moten's work in The Break, a book that many, many people want to think with. And if you want to think with Fred Moten's work, you have to accept and reconcile to a kind of essential brokenness that for Moten does not require fixing. Okay, so this is part of our destituent standpoint, is that we want to live in the break, live with the break, and recognize that some of the modes of trying to fix what is wrong with the world are the problem in the first place. Okay, so some of the rampant viral infections that we're now going to be subject to, for example, have at least in part been spurred by attempts to fix health only by using more and more powerful medicine, as opposed to thinking about health as a much more holistic thing that has to do with not eating radiated foods and not using pesticides and not, just having a sort of massive agribusiness decide that there should only be 2 seeds in the world, which is why wheat has become toxic to so many people. So many of the remedies for what might be wrong are in fact the foundation for what has become disastrous. So if we lived with the breakage in some of the systems that currently we find ourselves in, we might come to different conclusions. So let me give you a few examples, okay? And just in case you're like, I don't think so. All right, so let's, in chapter 4 of this Invisible Committee book, which is just called, by the way, in our temporal frame, again, it's called Now. Now, that's it, N-O-W. So they argue that there are a couple of things that we would have to destitute in order for this world that we currently live in that really sort of incarcerates us ideologically and in relationship to the non-human and vegetal world, there are a couple of areas that we're going to have to destitute. And you'll recognize this as very much a kind of anarchist program for unbuilding, unmaking institutions, okay? And if ever there was a moment to try to think about how institutions should be unbuilt, believe me that this is it. We are there now, okay? Now, as the title of this book suggests. So just to give us an example, the judicial system. The judicial system, we know in universities, we know in abolition movements, we know that incarceration is not good. We know that the judicial system simply delivers massive numbers of people of color to tiny cells and does nothing about white-collar crime that is really the force that is ruining us in this day and age. So let's destitute the judicial system. And they say, in order to settle our disputes ourselves. That's kind of an anarchist principle. Some of you may know Sarah Schulman's book of a couple of years ago. I can't remember the name of it. Argument is not abuse. Yeah, exactly. And in that book, she borrows from some methods associated with domestic abuse communities where the desire is never to call the police. The desire is to learn to settle disputes ourselves. And notice that the reason we can't do that nowadays is because we are all online all the time on social media where there are massive forces, trolls, and algorithms that are stacked against us, making sure that we're only further divided. So the judicial system is set up to protect the very wealthy from any claims on that wealth coming from the poor. And anyone who tries to make any kind of incursion through informal economy will end up in jail. Destitute the legal system. How about medicine? And I know right now we don't want to destitute medicine because we feel like it's the thin red line between us and infection. But as I said, part of the situation that we're in comes from having too much medication and not enough other solutions to health and living in a body, okay? So in recent years, it's a little bit like that moment when, do you remember on Facebook where you used to have a feed where you saw your friends and you're like, oh, that person's doing that thing and that person, and then suddenly it was ads and it was no one that you'd ever heard of and it had changed overnight with an algorithm? That happened to healthcare recently. It happened in about the last 5 years. That you went from going to a doctor who would put a hand on you, who would palpate, who would feel your body, and who would figure out maybe some of the things that were wrong with you that didn't require medication. We are now in an era of dispensing drugs. That's why we have an opioid epidemic, isn't it? It's not just that young people are drug addicts. We have 9-year-olds on prescription drugs, right? So most of those drugs are legally prescribed. Destitute medicine. Destitute medicine. This is what Paul Preciado calls the pharmacopornographic regime. And he wrote his book, Testo Junkie, some 11 years ago. And it was incredibly prescient about the fact that we were about to be subject to domination that we couldn't even see coming, and that was going to be a molecular form of domination working from the inside out, such that we are, according to him, in terms of this pharmacopornographic, we are all subject to these fluctuations of pain and pleasure, pornographic and the pharmaceutical. And so you take the drug to resolve the pain, and then the pain becomes the result of having taken the drug, so there's another drug for that, and so on, okay? There are other uses of drugs that indigenous people have used. Michael Pollan has recently written a brilliant book called How to Change Your Mind about different uses for drugs, for plant-based drugs that can have really, really effective impact on the body as a system, separate from us all being implanted in this medical system that doesn't give us free health care, but is constantly selling us drugs. Selling us drugs at one end of the social scale, while people who sell drugs on the street, at the other end of the social scale, are the ones being put in jail. Destitute the judicial system, okay? All right, so once you've gone that far, if you're with me so far, you're going to want to destitute the government. And believe me, if we're choosing between Joe Biden and Trump, we better destitute it now, okay? Because we are not, there's no choice. That's not a choice. That's two very old white men who have not a single idea or platform between them. And I'm sorry if anyone supports these people. It's not about those people. It's about a system that, again, is about making sure that the people who run things are very, very wealthy and have nothing to do with you or me, and therefore do not represent our interests. Under those conditions, you must destitute the government. And this has happened in places like Ecuador, where in the 1990s, indigenous groups, in order to stop the government from coming on their Yasuni, on the lands of the Yasuni, and taking the oil, they were active day and night politically, and they brought down, over the course of the 90s, 6 governments. By the time the 6th government had fallen, the Ecuadorian president said, if you continue this level of disruption in this country will be ungovernable. At which point the indigenous groups were like, great, our work is done. We must become ungovernable. Okay, and then finally, if we're going to do all of these other things, then we better destitute the university. And I know we like to hold out for the idea that the university is the last bastion where we can have a critique of capital and exchange great ideas. But the real work of the university, and you can see it in the way in which money is being pulled out of the humanities, is to create policy for the government that we're all about destituting. So the university is going to have to go to. And I'm sure you have other institutions that you would like to destitute, and I invite you to play along at home and figure out. And then the question, oh, well, then what would we do? Well, this is why you have to look to the past, because there have been many other periods in history where people, and there are many other political systems around the world where people are not simply governed by big business and their interests, where people do elect the people that they trust, where autonomous groups have some impact, and so on. And we should be looking for those examples. If this sounds familiar, it's because some of this can be found in Moten and Harney's work, the manifesto on the Undercommons, which many, many students really like, and you know, which I wrote an intro for because I thoroughly believe in it. And that is the argument of the Undercommons, is A, destitute the university, but B, bring everything else down too, and C, do other kinds of studying together in other places that are more vital than the university and in places that are going to have more impact than the university. So, and the real problem, says Moten and Harney, is not just institutions, but politics itself. Never was there a better time for you guys to be willing to hear that the actual problem is the thing called politics, okay? We are the general antagonism to politics, they say, looming outside every attempt to politicize, every imposition of self-governance, every sovereign decision in its degraded miniature, every emergent state and home sweet home. We are disruption, and we consent to disruption. We preserve upheaval. That is the only way forward, is by looking back for examples of disruption, upheaval, and the withdrawal of consent. So on behalf of that, Moten and Harney continue, we're already here. If you want to say, okay, but what is that? Where are we doing this? I'm going to give you an example, okay? But in order to do that, let me remind you that Moten and Harney aren't saying the Undercommons is to come. They're saying it's here. We're already here, moving. We've been around. We're more than politics, more than settled, more than democratic. We surround democracy's false image in order to unsettle it. Every time it tries to enclose us in a decision, we're undecided. Every time it tries to represent our will, we're unwilling, okay? Now, I want you to join a coalition tonight of the unwilling, and I want to give you a leader. Okay? I know it sounds very un-anarchist to have a leader, but it's okay because this is a fabulous drag queen from the past who's not really doing political work anymore, but we can lead through her example. Anyone remember Joan Jett Black? No. See? You know Caitlyn Jenner, but you don't know Joan Jett Black, who is a legend, a legendary Black drag queen. And I'm saying drag queen, it's not clear that Joan Jett Black was a trans asterisk person. I'm not sure, so I'm going to call them a drag queen, and they. But they ran for president, seriously, twice in the 1990s. And this is what I mean about looking back to look forward. By the way, Eileen Miles ran for president too around that time, as did Murray Hill, who was a famous drag king in New York City at the time. We need to put up our candidates, however absurd they may be, and I'm going to give you a platform right now, should anyone want to do this. So Joan Jett Black ran for president in 1992 on the ticket of the Queer Nation Party, and her motto was, "Lick Bush in 92." I don't know why that didn't work. That sounds like the way to go. So she didn't get elected, came back 1996 with a different platform and a new party. She's sick of the Queer Nation Party. She's like, we don't need nation. She became the leader of the Black Pantsuit Party, okay? And no relation to Hillary Clinton's pantsuits, in fact, very different. But the new motto was, by any means necessary. Okay, so what did Joan Jett Black run on? Joan Jett Black went to the Democratic Convention with a journalist's pass in boy drag, got into the convention, changed into girl drag, and made it up onto the stage where she was able to give her stump speech. And her stump speech is something like this, and I'm completely kind of attributing this to her based on the little bit that I know. Joan Jett Black realized, as I hope you all realize, that in any given election, less than half of this population of this country votes. Less than half. This is why we're not really living in a democracy. In a democracy, there should be a certain level of participation that legitimates it. And it is not simply the case that people are apathetic, as you well know. There are people in jail who can't vote. Why can't people in jail vote? People in jail have very, very good reasons to vote, by the way, okay? People in jail can't vote. If you are a felon and you have not yet done the paperwork to clear your file, you cannot vote. If you live in a poor area, they'll make sure that there aren't enough polling stations, you cannot vote. If you're Black, you very often cannot vote, okay? If you're very poor and you have to work 3 jobs, the chances of you being able to stand in line, not good, you cannot vote. If you're very young in this country, you cannot vote. But if you're old and senile, you can vote. It's okay. Why cannot the young vote? Why can the very old vote, right? We have created a system in this country where over half the population cannot vote. Homeless people do not vote, all right? So that is, by the way, a coalition of the unwilling, and one that I believe would be willing to go with us, or in fact would lead the way to destituting all of those institutions, not one of which actually works for them. So that was Joan Jett Black's platform. To me, that's a winning platform. She figured 51% of the population is available. She said, if you want me for president, don't vote. I will take your non-votes. She went to the Iowa primary. 440,000 people did not vote. She declared victory. And I know it sounds like just a kind of stunt, but it's not a stunt. It's not a stunt that more people don't vote than do vote. Guess what? Not voting is voting. And it's voting for destitution of the shitty political system that has put you in a position to vote for 2 people who seem to be exactly the same. And it reveals the fact that this choice is not a choice. So that's what I mean, okay, by destitution. And it is not without precedent or examples. This is not a movement that is just pie in the sky. This, in the 1990s, there were all kinds of subcultural figures running on these kinds of seemingly absurd platforms that were nonetheless less absurd than the platforms that currently the guys that we're asked to vote for are running on. Not one of them actually has a platform in mind. All right, so I've sold you on destitution, at least 2 of you. So let's move on to dereliction. I'll do this a little bit more quickly in the interest of time, because I'm sure you'll have questions. So just to leave this as a kind of symbolic, I talked about it at the beginning, so I'll do this much more quickly. I really got interested in this anarchitecture group from the 1970s, led by Gordon Matta Clark, who is the son of a very famous Chilean painter. And Gordon Matta Clark, his father and mother broke up, and his mother moved to New York City from Chile. He grew up in New York City, where buildings were literally falling down around him. Decided to go to architecture school at Cornell and learned architecture very well in order to undo it from the inside out. And he named what he was doing anarchitecture, that holds within it the idea of anarchy, but also commits itself to unbuilding. And one of his first acts was to go to his mentor's show. His mentor, Peter Eisenman, very famous architect, invited him to be part of a show in the Bronx at this building and to come and do an installation. This is great for anyone who wants to go to grad school. This is a great first way of responding to your mentor. So he goes to the building in the Bronx that his mentor has invited him to, and he takes a BB gun and he shoots every window out of that building. Okay, at which point Peter Eisenman is like, please leave, don't ever come back, I never want to see you again, and they never talked again. Okay, but this is the 1970s, and this is, if you think about broken windows now, you know that broken windows are central to policing projects that suggest that broken windows are signs of broken communities. But what Matta Clark wanted to call attention to was the way in which the Bronx was being completely abandoned by new gentrification measures in the city, and that we may as well blow the windows out ourselves and start unbuilding the city, because the projects for building were going to be much worse. And he couldn't have been more right about the building that went on in the Bronx that brought huge highways right through the middle of the neighborhoods, while not bringing highways through the middle of more expensive neighborhoods in Brooklyn. So anarchitecture, he set himself up against the great modernist Le Corbusier, who was associated in World War II with fascism, and who absolutely believed that you could manage populations by building. You build what he called machines to live in, and you manage populations by slotting them into these very orderly and organized environments in which their whole understanding of life is kind of managed and laid out for them. And here's Le Corbusier's big saying is, everything must hold together or else it will collapse. Okay, and remember that point about tension. You can also hear it in this next quote, man must be built upon the axis of harmony in perfect agreement with nature and probably the universe. Okay, you can hear that modernist notion that architecture must reflect nature and the universe and balance and harmony and order. Order, by the way, was the absolute obsession of fascists. That's why you still have very orderly streets in European capitals like Madrid and Berlin, all roads leading to one monumental piece of architecture. That's order. Order that anarchist anthropologists like James C. Scott have critiqued, and he wrote a book called Seeing Like a State, in which he argued that these kinds of architectures force us to see the world a certain way, and that we need architectures that allow us to see the world differently. So Matta Clark's saying, on the other hand, was he wanted to find the exact point in a building between supports and collapse. So we're not just arguing for tearing everything down. One of his big projects was something called splitting, and he split a house in the suburbs down the middle, and he made it so it didn't fall apart, it just fell open. And that's so brilliant, architecturally speaking, to open a house like that, because what it does is it's like showing the construction so that you can peer inside, see the kind of heteronormative arrangement of the rooms, understand the domestic ideology that's gone into it, see the architectural principles at work, see that we understand houses only in terms of families. We do not set up houses for friends, for roommates, for people who don't know each other but are working together, for immigrants, for temporary workers. Those architectures we should be building. Instead, we build everything on the model of the family. And when you open the house up, you see that. He also did this. He did something called a conceptual project called Fake Estates, in which he found all of these little gutter pieces of land in New York City. Like anytime you buy property, there's often a little piece that you don't own. And the city owns it, but there's nothing to be done with it. So he bought up a bunch of these little pieces of land with the hope of sort of accumulating these gutter spots in order to make them unoccupiable. And you can hear there's also a critique of occupation in here. Possession, occupation. He bought the pieces of land so nothing could be done with them, and that would limit anyone who was trying to extend their property. Other people who've thought about architecture in kind of queer ways include Paul Preciado, who wrote a whole book called Pornotopia about post-war masculinity as a kind of architectural relationship to post-war opportunities, in which the family and the wife are out in the suburbs. Think Mad Men, if anyone ever saw Mad Men. All the women are out in the suburbs going crazy. Betty Friedan, that's the theme of Feminine Mystique, one of the first books of feminism. And the men, what do? The white middle-class men, they buy bachelor pads in the city, set up for their mistresses. That, Preciado says, is bachelor masculinity. And in order to understand it, he said we needed to understand Playboy, the Playboy mansion, the Playboy bunny, the Playboy clubs, and so on. And it's a much quirkier, much more interesting way of thinking about what post-war white masculinity looked like than just, some of the models that we're using today. But if patriarchy has been built, then it must be unbuilt. Then it must be unbuilt. Now we know what feminism should be doing, unbuilding patriarchy. But you know who said that a long time ago? Audre Lorde. Audre Lorde, in a slogan that has become a bumper sticker, but that we should return to, in fact, with an anarchitectural view, said, for the master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. Okay? The master's tools will never dismantle the master's house. We tend to take this phrase and we say, oh, don't use mastery, don't use the master's tools, don't use grand narratives. It's not about the tools. It's about dismantling the master's house. It's an anarchitectural statement about pulling everything down. All right. I'm going to close up this. I just want you to see this work that Matt Clark did. He built, he would cut shapes into crumbling architectures, the very architectures that Alvin Baltrop, the black photographer, was photographing around the same time. And in the 1970s, according to Douglas Crimp, if you went into the piers, and the piers are the thing of legend for gay men, it was the place of cruising, completely outside and off limits to Manhattan, because the West Side Highway had collapsed in the early 70s and left the deindustrialized waterfront really inaccessible. So what happened was communities sprung up there of gay men, drug users, homeless people, and runaways. And there you had a whole community of the dispossessed, a coalition of the unwilling. They lived there, and Matt Clark came and made this beautiful cut into the side of the pier to let light in order to create a kind of cathedral effect, to say, this is not a space of abjection, this is a beautiful place, and poor people should have architecture too, and I want to create a kind of symphony of light and water. So we also made a cut into the bottom of the pier. Samuel Delany, who I hope many of you have heard of, wrote an autobiography called The Motion of Light on Water. Much of it was about spending time in the piers cruising. And you can't help but think that that title comes from this work. So there it is. This is his sort of contribution, if you like, to queer worlds. This is Alvin Baltrop's work showing us how dilapidated the piers were. And no one wanted them rebuilt, okay? Remember how I said repair can be the problem? You know what the piers are now? The piers now are golf course golf places where you hit balls out into the Hudson, thank you. Sports center, bowling ring, ice skating, places for the quite wealthy to go and work out, okay? No one wanted the piers to be repaired. As they were, they formed an alternative revolutionary site that we should be thinking about instead of Stonewall. Forget about Stonewall. Stonewall is a narrative that has been made up and sold to us when, in fact, many things had happened before 1969 in the first place, but many other things were happening off limits and away from the gaze of the police in communities that never went to the bars in the first place. That's where we should be looking. 1970s, this landscape of dispossession. David Wojnarowicz was in the piers making murals without seeking to sell them. This is not about the art market. This is just kind of murals to fuck by, right? This is just the backdrop to gay men's cruising, which at the time was considered to be a kind of anti-capitalist, restless motion that had not been accumulated into some kind of model of consumption. And you'll see how that works in a moment. There's a beautiful piece, Day's End, by Gordon Matta-Clark, photographed by Alvin Baltrop. And Douglas Crimp in his article tries to pit Baltrop and Matta-Clark against each other because Matta-Clark was straight and Baltrop was gay. But for me, I want to think about them together, both of them collaborating to hold on to these collapsed architectures and make something gorgeous out of them. And there it is, the piers. There you can see the collapsed architectures. Just under the 1948, do you see that little white speck? That's two men having sex. And this is what I love about Baltrop's work, is that the scale is fantastic. This is about the erotics of the architecture, not about the specific pornographic gaze at men having sex. The two men are having sex, and the sex becomes monumental because they have been reduced to nothing against the backdrop of collapse. And there's a whole theory of desire right in there about collapse, about smallness, about becoming nothing. Nothing being one of the big monikers of Gordon Matta-Clark. Nothing matters, he said. Here's the collapsed architecture. Here's Day's End. And what do we have today? Okay, no more cruising in areas of dispossession. No more gestural, haptic languages of possibility and potential, just taking all of that material, uploading it into an algorithm, and selling gay men's desire back to them as liberation, which it is not, it is capital. Okay? So that's why we go back to look forward, because what is representing itself as liberation is in fact the end of a cycle of potential liberatory activity comes to an end. All right, it wouldn't be good enough, however, to just talk about men having sex in the piers, because those places were pretty dangerous for girls. So in the next section, I want to talk about revolutionary girls as the absolute center point of a politics of dereliction, destitution, and dispossession. That, in fact, is one of the arguments of Saidiya Hartman's new book, Wayward Lives, Beautiful Experiments, Intimate Histories of Social Upheaval. And I'm sure you've heard of this book, and if you haven't, you should rush out and buy it. This book, which is, very, very much in sync with this idea that we need to look back to find anarchist activities that are running counter to the language of progress and making and building. One of the things that Hartman does in this book is look at black girls, the lives of black girls, from the records of the social workers, the prison guards, and the various other bureaucrats who tried to press black girls coming to the city looking for freedom back into domestic servitude. So what Hartman does is she takes the very materials used by prison guards and social workers to describe the girls. She takes those same materials and uses them to describe their rebellion to the norms of racial domination. So while these black girls, many black girls left the South, came to the North, looked for freedom, looked for pleasure, looked for places where they could play, where they could be free, where they could pursue beauty, what they found was that there was no work, was that they could be arrested for nothing, was that their husbands and boyfriends were being put away, was that being on the street was enough to get them classified with a term that was only used for black girls at that time, wayward. Wayward. And waywardness was seen as a status crime, so you would not accuse a white man who was wandering around on the street of waywardness, but if a black woman was on the street and did not have a destination, she was wayward. And if you were accused of waywardness, you could be put in jail. Therefore, the jails were full of black women. And the records of these black women in the jails is that they rebelled. And the social workers and the prison records will say, this girl was very rebellious. This girl would not take instruction. This young woman openly was violent to the gods. And that's supposed to be judgment against the girl or against the young woman. Hartman says, these are the records of rebellion, or what she calls open rebellion. And we have to read the historical record to piece back together the artifacts of rebellion. And here she says, not only were they rebellious, but they were rebellious in coordination under the sign of anarchy. Anarchy because it was the state who was doing this to them in the first place. Therefore, destitute the judicial system, destitute the schools, destitute all of these social services that are supposedly provided to you, because this is just slavery by any other means. But what she points out, and here's the quote, she points out that these little moments of clear rebellion that dot the archives are not read as such. They're just read as judgments. But what they actually form, she says, is an account of anarchy, a grand theory of anarchy, no less, that should be read instead of the male architects of anarchy that we've been reading. So Wayward Lives, Anarchy, the anarchy of black girls, as one chapter calls it, arranged in a riotous manner. That's actually the name of a chapter, because that was in a police record, that there was an anarchy of black girls who were arranged in a riotous manner, for which they were arrested. And she's like, oh my God, there was an anarchy of black girls arranged in a riotous manner, right? Do you see? So like Linebaugh and Redeker, who wrote the classic Many-Headed Hydra in order to use the records of capitalism to tell a story of anti-capitalism, she reads the records of incarceration of black women to tell a story of open rebellion led by black women against the system. That's where we want to look and begin our movement towards anarchy and deinstitutionalization. Fortunately, the 70s gave us films about this. Again, look back to look forward. Has anyone here seen Born in Flames? One or two. Okay, as Dean Spade said in a dossier dedicated to this film, how is this film ever made? Okay, this is a film about a revolutionary cadre of black and white women working together in the wake of a socialist revolution. It's like Bernie wins, and it's still not good for trans people and queer people. And so Born in Flames is like, what if we had a socialist revolution and nothing changed? So you get a group of white and black women arguing with each other around race issues, but at least putting the issues on the table, and fighting against rape by rounding up rapists in vigilante groups, fighting against the government, and get this, one of the women, Honey, goes on a mission to Central Africa to get arms. I mean, this is, okay, it's 1979. She goes and gets trained in a revolutionary cadre run by former Iranian revolutionaries, and does a deal to get guns to come back to the US with the guns to take arms against the government. That's what this film is about. Holy shit. Okay. And this is being made at the exact same time that Gordon Matlock and Alvin Baltrop are pulling these buildings down. So do you want to see the trailer for the film, just so you know what to go and look? Yeah. So Ruth, we might want to bring the lights down a little bit, if somebody can do that. Yeah. Sorry about the volume.
We are interrupting this program to bring you a special message from the Women's Army.
Special message from the Women's Army.
Which would you rather see come through the door? One lion, unified, or 500 mice?
What do you want to see come through the door? One lion or 500 mice? Obviously 500
All
mice.
oppressed people have a right to violence.
The working class about its name of America's mystery. Why is it called
Done.
Women's Army? A manifesto strong and federal, talking about a declaration in an undercover nation. She's got a black jack and the wings of a dove. She's got a iron fist and a velvet glove. Just got a ticket 'cause the red ones do. Wake up, could this be you? Could this be you? All right.
All right, we can put the lights back. Spoiler alert, at the end, they go into the World Trade Center and they blow up the communication tower on the top. Again, holy shit, how was this film ever made? 1979, made with an all-women crew. It's an absolute classic, and it gets at these issues that seem so far-fetched now, but were on the tips of people's tongues in the 1970s. That's why I'm pushing back to the 1970s, because anarchy was really a thing then. And there were a lot of cultural materials available to people to think about anarchy at that time, whether it was in relationship to the Red Army faction in Europe or civil rights movement in the US. There were many coalitions that had not yet splintered into these identitarian factions that could not figure out how to work with one another. And Lizzie Borden, the director, sees this as kind of science fiction. She says in the bottom line, because I don't believe it will happen. And that was also true. She uses science fiction in the same way that Octavia Butler does, and as we'll see, Ursula Le Guin does, to imagine alternative arrangements of rebellion and anarchy in the future. I won't talk about this one in the interest of time, except to say here's yet another, if you thought like, oh great, there was one of these films. No, there actually were a lot. And here's one called Times Square. Two young girls run away. Guess they run out of a mental institution where they've been placed. One is the daughter of the guy who's in charge of gentrification in the city. The other one is a runaway. And they go, guess where? To the piers, and they make a little home there with scavenged material, and their biggest thing is about friendship and friendship with other girls. They form a punk band called the Sleaze Sisters. Have you ever heard of this film? Right, it's crazy. This is the best queer film you've never seen, okay? It had a real punk soundtrack with the Ramones and the Clash and all kinds of people on it, but they never promoted the film. And because the sex scene was taken out, the director just dropped it. But these films between them show us a different understanding of feminism, of queer feminism, of trans feminism from a different era, again, where everyone wasn't siloed into identitarian categories, but understood their struggle to be a coalition with many, many different groups involved. We won't show that one. All right. So I'm going to end then, and I'll just end by giving you the one anarchist sci-fi book that is anyone's ever written that has a really clear analysis of anarchy in it is Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed. And I love this book so much, I can't even tell you. I've read it 3 times in the last year. Because there's a little lesson in it, and it's that lesson that I want to close with. So the hero of Ursula Le Guin's The Dispossessed is a physicist, Shevik, who has discovered a theory of simultaneity. And simultaneity is a great temporal frame to think about in terms of even if it's just like simultaneous general strikes everywhere, or whatever it may be. Simultaneity, okay? And he lives on an anarchist planet that some time ago split off from the capitalist planet under the teachings of a very wise person called Odo, which I took as my Twitter handle. But apparently you can't just be Odo, so then I have 15 numbers after it, which means I can never remember my own Twitter handle. Anyway, Odo's teachings caused some people to go to another very desolate, barren planet and really try to live as an anarchist society, which means that the physicist has to also clean the toilets. And the people who clean the toilets also spend time every week in meditation and thinking, okay? And you don't own your kids. Your kids go to a creche, and they're the property of everyone, or they're not the property of anyone. And you don't exclusively function as a heterosexual or a homosexual, but you try to be in relation to people and become somebody in that relationship, and so on. But Shevik has a theory of possession in this book that's so meaningful in relationship to everything I've been saying tonight. And here you can hear, I think, the echo of an anti-carceral project, but also the echo of Gordon Matta Clark. He says, "Those who build walls are their own prisoners. I'm going to fulfill my proper function in the social organism. I'm going to unbuild walls." So you can see already, 1974, when this book was written, when Gordon Matta Clark was making his anarchitectural buildings come to the point of collapse. Unbuilding is already an anarchist principle, but it's more than that, and this is the book. So Shevik goes to the capitalist planet. He can't believe that he has his own space, his private room. All he has to do is study, do his physics. He drinks, he eats amazing food, he has lots of sex, and he's like, oh my God, I love it here. You know, he's just like giddy with this kind of pharmacopornographic world that he's fallen into. He's so excited, and then it's like one of these sci-fi films. Suddenly he sees that it's all rotten. And he's wandering around on a big street, and he doesn't want to buy anything, and he doesn't want to drink anything, and he doesn't want to go to the stupid party later. And he's sick of the difference between him and the guy who cleans his room. And at that point, he's contacted by a member of the Revolutionary Underground. And he decides to join the Revolutionary Underground. He runs away from the Institute, and he goes to speak to the revolutionary groups who are gathered at their own peril in the square. And this is what he says. He says, "We know that there is no help for us but from one another, that no hand will save us if we do not reach out our hand, and that the hand you reach out is as empty as mine is. You have nothing. You possess nothing. You own nothing. You are free. All you have is what you are and what you give." Now, that is the central principle to dispossession. We cannot be free through ownership. We cannot be free through possession, because possession is the original principle of this country, in this incarnation of it, the occupation of the lands of indigenous people, the dispossession of the indigenous on the one hand, and on the other hand, the possession of other people as slaves. And that is the lineage of possession that takes us through real estate and into the realm of unbuilding, dereliction, and destitution. And it's right here. If you own nothing, only then are you in relationship to freedom. What are you free of? Ownership. Ownership is a burden, not an opportunity. So I want to end then with an image from a trans biracial performer with whom I collaborate, Boychild, who at the Venice Biennale this year, outside of the paid exhibits, on an unnamed hillock that people just had to find every day for an hour, boy child performed, and this is one that he did in a gallery, he performed what he calls hand dances. And I like to think of them as being an image of empty-handedness, the empty-handedness that comes from dispossession. There was no music, there was no sound. It was just people sitting, breathing together, sitting alongside each other, watching someone be without. And that, to me, that is just like the most beautiful gesture that I can give to you is nothing. Thank you.
We will be taking questions now.
Hello. Hello. Yes.
Or comments, disagreements. Oh, wait.
I was wondering, like, what your perception of labor unions are, because, like, you know, the whole, like, contract negotiations and stuff, it's like working with the system, but it's also like collaborating and like unionizing outside of the system to kind of like fight back on the inequality. So I was just curious what you think about them.
Yeah. Well, I mean, in this system, you have to have unions, but notice that unions increasingly are distanced from the workers that they're supposed to represent. They too have sort of been corrupted by big money interests. So we don't have a kind of pure understanding of unions any longer, but you know, unions are really powerful demonstrations of what can happen with solidarity. And I just showed a film I love in one of my classes last week when we were still meeting as classes. It's called Pride. Do people know that cute little gay film, Pride? It comes out of England. It's a true story. And it's a story about, in the early 1980s, there was a group of it was really LGs at that point, but let's say LGT, because I'm sure there were lots of Ts. LGT Pride March, they collected money that was supposed to be for the LGT Association, and they decided, this was the first couple of years of the Thatcher government, that the miners, the striking miners in England, needed the money more than they did. So they took the money and they went to Wales, and this is a true story. They went to Wales and they delivered the money to the miners, and the miners, who were a homophobic lot at best, were just like, we're not taking money from these queers, you know, and then they're like, well, it is money. Is it that bad that they're queers? And anyway, the film is beautiful because it shows how much each side, like the LGBT group was pretty bourgeois and the mining group was very working class. But the thing that brings them together is not the sort of Gloria Gaynor, I will survive anthem. The anthem in the film is, there is power in a union. And there's a really powerful, beautiful spectacle at the end of the film where the queer group has shown up for the miners, and there's another, and the miners come by the busload to show up for the queers and march at the very head of the march. And this is a true story. And they march singing both Bread and Roses and There is Power in a Union. And without hitting you over the head with it, the narrative of the film is kind of, you know, let's all get our heads out of our butts and figure out how to be in coalition in these difficult times. And one of the main things that happens in the film is the main character says, you know, Thatcher hates you, Thatcher hates us. She wants to denationalize the industry, that's bad for the unions. She's making a war on working class people, and she's all about normative families. Don't we have a lot in common? Let's move forward from there. If you read Christina Hanhart's book, Safe Space, she shows that in the 1970s and 1980s, queer-based coalitions were massive solidarity machines that were about anti-racism and anti-poverty. And it was only when a narrative of anti-violence came into the discourse that this whole thing about safe space emerged. And one of the big reveals of Christina Hanhart's research is that anti-violence campaigns mostly targeted communities of color and brought more and more police into queer areas, which made it very hostile for people of color. And that began a separation that we are now living with today. So it's a long-winded way of saying that the union is a great way of thinking about the kind of solidarities that we need in this moment if we are to confront the kind of political crisis that we're in.
This is a question that I guess I just thought of as you were speaking to the last question, which is, I guess, antagonism as like a framework for moving forward, I guess, or moving into the future. How not to make antagonism a new breeding ground for new nationalisms, or new kind of like these new formative groups with power that perpetuate us versus them ideologies.
Yeah. I think, I mean, 2 words, get offline. I think that the communication structure that we're embedded in on social media is set up for antagonism. I mean, why do we all end up in these silly little fights? Why are people being canceled? Why can't you have a disagreement? Why does a disagreement rise to a kind of, mega level? So I think that what you're asking is a really good question, which is, why is the temperature of so much of our political debate very elevated at a moment when other kinds of conversations are called for? And the problem with social media is that we don't see the invisible architecture that is kind of forming and molding our speech. And it seems as if you're writing something and it's going through nothing to someone, but it is going through something. And its abbreviated form necessarily means that the tone is constantly much shorter than you would like, right? So it's no accident that when somebody's grumpy, we say they're short-tempered, right? That they go off too quickly, they're on a short fuse. The shortness, particularly, this is why Twitter is particularly bad, the compression of an idea into 240 characters necessarily means massive amounts of complexity are lost, right? We can barely even read big books anymore. I mean, although I'm trying to figure out why people do read Knausgård. You know who I mean, right? The Norwegian author who wrote a book called My Struggle, Mein Kampf. Am I the only person here who even read him? Thank you. I'm also trying to figure out whether women ever write multi-volume books that they expect the whole world to read. And I know Elena Ferrante did, and I read it. And I read Knausgård, and I've read Bolaño, and all of these multi-volume people. I even read the 3 volumes of IQ 84. But I think this is patriarchy, is like maximalization and minimalization. It's both. And I wonder if there are other scales available to us. So I think the question of antagonism is the tonality within scalar questions. There's one there and then here. Yeah.
So going back to what you were saying about destitution earlier, using medicine as an example.
Okay.
So you destitute that institution, and then I'm curious, like, what comes after that kind of destruction? And is it not selfish in a way to do something like that and impose it on other people who aren't with that idea?
All right, great question. It's not a question of what comes after. It's what came before. Like, what came before we just handed somebody an opioid, okay? Because you know how recently we didn't hand people opioids? Like 5 or 10 years ago. Like, just 5 or 10 years ago, we didn't just give people a pill to dull the pain. So it's not just what comes after, it's what other models of medicine have we practiced somewhat successfully. Even right now, people are pointing out that in Europe, where there is national health care, in most places, people get the health care that they need in this moment of crisis. Whereas in the US, there are huge numbers of people uninsured or who cannot afford the copay, or who can't get on the phone for 2 hours to make the appointment, whatever it may be. In a health crisis of the proportions that we're facing, we are the country least likely to be able to manage it. So the question is not like, are we being selfish by saying, oh, destitute medicine? Because what about all the people who will suddenly, not have access to health? What about all the people who don't have access to health? They just don't have it now already. And Bernie was saying, hey, if you elect me, you don't have to pay for health. And people are like, well, how would you pay for that? The same way every other country pays for it. Tax the rich. You make the corporations pay. I mean, it's like, well, you need $36 trillion. Have you looked at the ways in which people manage to find loopholes not to pay their taxes? The math is not difficult. We could also have national health care, as the UK does, as France does, as Italy does, as Germany does. It's not like nowhere in the world does this. Everywhere in the world does this. We don't. So it's not about, oh, how selfish of you, you would want to get rid of the way we do health care now. No. How can we make health care that isn't just for you because you actually are able to pay for it, but is for everyone? A health system that doesn't take care of the most vulnerable is just not worth anything, because as we're about to find out, the most vulnerable are the weak link. We don't have to worry about the people who are somewhat strong. You have to worry about the weak, the vulnerable, the people who haven't had good and sustained health care over the course of their lives, people living in wretched situations who are vulnerable to all kinds of toxins. Those are the people who are going to fall sick rapidly and disastrously. And they will be, whether you like it or not, a burden on a healthcare system that is not at all prepared, not just for a crisis, it isn't even prepared for, everyday medical eventualities. So this is not about what comes next. This is about why don't we get in line with everybody else?
Question is related. I thought it was interesting that you didn't bring up the AIDS crisis at all in your presentation. So I just wondered how you fit that in.
See, in a way, the AIDS crisis has led us to Grindr, and the AIDS crisis. Here's a great example of what I was saying at the beginning, which is that very often when something's broken, the fix is worse. So the fix that we've come up with for HIV is a prophylactic that gay men can take every day, which is just a new population that has another pill to take every day. That then, do you know long-term what happens if you take Truvada from a very young age to a very old age? What will this mean? And then, has the way in which we've decided to resolve the AIDS crisis been the problem? Remember, one of the mottos of when the ACT UP group split into the two groups, and one was about just getting drug trials and putting pressure on the pharmaceutical companies, and the other side of ACT UP was all about social activism and making solidarity with drug users and other people who were vulnerable to infection. In a way, the people who said drugs into bodies won, because what we have as our resolution is drugs into bodies. And I think that then leads us to individualist solutions, and plus it's very expensive, which means lots of gay men can't take the daily pill, which means that if everyone else is taking it and then barebacking, you can't take it, you can't afford it, you don't have the health care, you're the vulnerable one again, right? So I think for me, the AIDS crisis it certainly doesn't fit as a liberatory narrative. You can see that I arrive at Grindr by saying this broken world of dispossession and recreation, dangerous as it was, and even though it partly contributes to the rise of the AIDS crisis, the resolution of cleaning up, gentrifying, and getting drugs into bodies has perhaps created another kind of dystopian turn. But maybe you were thinking something else there about the AIDS crisis, like where would you have gone with it? What were you thinking there? Or were you just thinking 1970s, gay men cruising, this has got to lead to something about the AIDS crisis?
No, I was thinking of gentrification of the mind.
Oh, yeah.
We were talking, or
yeah,
you
Sarah
were talking
Schulman's
about,
book.
Yeah, you were talking about the real estate in New York, and Sarah Schulman's whole book is about how the AIDS crisis had a pivotal position in the gentrification of Manhattan specifically. So I thought it was interesting that you didn't bring that up. You didn't.
It does though, and I think about it more in relationship to San Francisco, where the housing boom bust cycle was very much sort of can be tracked along the ups and downs of the AIDS crisis. So when people got sick and there was no solution, the whole real estate market tanked, and people were selling, and and then when the cocktails came along, that market firmed up really quickly. And there had already been these kind of gentrification battles between gentrifying gay men and black communities that were not gay in San Francisco in the Western Addition. I think there are more stories to be told about this than just the gentrification story that Schulman tells. I think there's stories about boom-bust cycles here. I think there's a question about the participation of gays and lesbians in gentrification. Remember, that was the topic of a really good film in the 90s called Flag Wars, which was about a historic black neighborhood in Ohio where gay and lesbian real estate agents started buying up the property and selling it to clients, and the black population was moved out. So there are stories here that are not very nice about gay and lesbian capitalists. We love to just say gays and lesbians do not make as much money as their straight counterparts. That's just not true for gay men. For white gay men, it's only true if you include massive numbers of poor, queer people of color, and then that brings the average down. But if you just do a comparison of 2 lesbian households, white women, middle class, and 2 gay men, white households, they make a lot more money than their straight counterparts. Because guess who's poor in this country? Straight women with kids. That's who's poor. And so again, where's our solidarity there, as opposed to just, always worrying in a way about intra-community issues? There should be a lot more to say about these kinds of adjacencies, is how I would put it. So not just gentrification, but a whole lot of other material about complicity. There's one at the back there.
Hello, I was wondering what an anarchitectural approach would be to having Joe Biden and Donald Trump as the next 2 possible
what would be about?
An architectural approach
to Joe Biden and Bernie Sanders
and Donald Trump. Well, I don't think
get rid of all of them. I mean,
yeah.
That's not an election. That's just, I mean, that's my point about the system. There's no choice there. So the point is the Joan Jett Black response, which is to say, who's not going to vote in this next election? If you see on election day that 51% of the population did not vote, that's the outcome. That's actually the outcome right there. Okay, that's the anarchitectural reading of the election, is not, this many people in Pennsylvania who said they were undecided until the last minute. We're being governed by the undecided. Let's be governed by the unwilling. How about that? That coalition of the unwilling who are unwilling to accept that we have only these choices between two people who do not present us with ideas, who keep funneling money back to Wall Street, who don't have any concepts for changing the disastrous course that we're on, and so on. I mean, I think some people are saying there'll have to be a third party now because with Biden, the Democrats and the Republicans are pretty much identical. There's one here at the back, and there's one here.
Oh, I get the mic. Hi. So I'm trans, and I get hormone therapy through Planned Parenthood. I'm wondering how I'm supposed to destitute medicine, but also still receive the. I wrote this down. Receive the important services from Planned Parenthood and other organizations similar to. How do I continue
You will
with
have
that?
a medical system that gives you what you need. So it would be, you're a trans person, you want testosterone, and the system is set up so that you get testosterone. It's not a matter of destitute the medical system. Well, how am I going to get my drugs for this or that? It's getting drugs through a system that is giving you what you need, not selling you addiction. Okay? I mean, I don't know. It doesn't, to me, that. What?
Don't pay your medical bills.
There you go. There you go. There you go. Don't pay your student loans. Don't pay your medical bills. Yeah, absolutely. And I know it just sounds crazy, but is it any crazier to just say, oh, how can I make sure that Planned Parenthood will still be available for me to get my testosterone in a year? I'm sure you're worried about that, So you shouldn't have to worry about that. We're forced to worry about the wrong things. And in the meantime, the world goes to shit because we're not putting our energy into the right things. Looks like we've got one back there with the beard. We'll take maybe one or two more and then.
I was just wondering, earlier you brought up the question of what happens if you have a revolution but there's no actual change that happens.
Oh, yeah. Born in flames, right.
I was thinking in terms mainly within kind of dismantling the patriarchy or heteronormative scripts, how you have revolution and have change when you can't change multiple people's values, because it seems we've had multiple revolutions but not much change because there's so many people with differing values.
Right. And believe me that I'm not here to tell you what will happen. I can only tell you what has happened in some corners of very, very interesting queer, subcultural, and aesthetic communities that give us kind of conceptual frameworks and imaginary worlds upon which to think with about potential alternative futures. It's not like, if we sit here long enough, we'll figure out how to change multiple people's minds. But as we're seeing with this virus, change will come. And if it doesn't come in the form that we mandate it because we've decided that we must change, then it will be forced upon us. I mean, you can see this in universities where I've been arguing for a long time that the humanities should change in order to meet the needs of students who are trained on the internet and who watch, animated films more than they watch French New Wave films. And I've been arguing for a long time. Let's change it ourselves before the university comes along and says, this is how we're going to reorient your field of study. We should be doing it. So we should be making these changes rather than waiting to see what will happen next. And that's really about young people doing it. And stop handing over agency and sovereignty to very old people who do not have your interests in mind.
All right, we could take one more question.
Hello. So I was really interested with Mata Clark's project about the fake estates and the gutter spots and unoccupiable spaces. And I saw an interesting similarity, but also kind of diametric opposition with the idea of hostile architecture. because they kind of have the same effect, but obviously very different intentions, and kind of dispossessing the places from different types of people. So I guess and also just Mata Clark's like quote of "nothing works."
Yeah.
And like hostile architecture being a very blatant example of purposefully making it so things don't work for people. I guess I was wondering if you've done research on like that idea.
I haven't, but that's why I was trying to make the comparison to Corbusier, who made sure that everything worked. You know, so that there's a sort of smooth functioning where state, family, you know, interior architecture, exterior architecture, everything's supposed to just flow from one space to the next. At least what would you give as an example of a hostile architecture?
So a lot of the examples I've seen are mostly trying to make it so that homeless people cannot sleep in certain places.
Oh, right.
So yeah, making it so that benches, you can sit in them, but not lie down on them.
Yeah, but those are built, those are not unbuilt. In fact, a lot of what homeless people do is unbuild the purpose of something in order to turn it to their own use. These are park benches that, you know, have ridges so that somebody can't lie there. So I feel like that hostile architecture is overbuilding, it's actually the opposite of what Mata Clark. And that bench, it isn't that nothing works on that bench, it's that something is at work, and that something that is at work is the management of people in public spaces, right? So the nothing working would be better there, because there'd be a kind of space available for somebody to lie down. Simple as that. The other piece, just the final thing that I want to say about why I was interested in Gordon Mata Clark, is that these cuts that he makes into the buildings have been compared to sex reassignment surgeries, because the house is often seen as a sort of female body that the male architect is cutting into. And in fact, Mata Clark was occasionally accused of assault on a body for the way in which he cut into the houses. And he took that charge on the one house he cut into. He was accused by one critic of raping the house. He took that charge so seriously and so undefensively that he never again worked on a domestic space. He always made cuts from then on into official and office buildings. But what I was interested in is how, you know, just to relate this back to the Gender Studies Conference, how we could think about trans not as building a new body, but as part of this unbuilding mechanism in which we unbuild the entire system within which binary gender makes sense. And by unbuilding it, all of these other genders come into view. And the proof is right there with the emergence of this category of non-binary. We wouldn't have a category like non-binary had we not done the work of unbuilding male and female in the first place. So maybe we could stop there. Thank you so much. Be well, be safe.
Thank you, everyone, for attending tonight's talk. We hope to see you all at the rest of our events tomorrow and Friday, and have a great evening.